Yeah, so I'm a PhD student at the University of Leeds in the School of Healthcare, and I suppose became interested in co-production because my PhD is exploring mental health practice. So my background's as a social worker, and I'm looking at how approved mental health professionals, who are quite often social workers, make decisions during Mental Health Act assessments. And one of the I suppose aspects of that that's interested me is that when decisions are made under that Act, they should be underpinned by what are called a set of guiding principles, which include things like encouraging the person who's been assessed to participate and for their views and wishes to be respected. So for me, when I start to think about co-production, I suppose in line with the seminar series and some of the discussions that have arisen through those, is how it might fit with those guiding principles and perhaps the value base that has put those guiding principles in place. So I presented at the seminar about co-production in coercive settings because I suppose that's the narrowed down bit that I've been thinking about. So more broadly, how co-production works within mental health services, but then at that really important event that often people who come into contact with mental health services experience, how we can put that into practice there, because ultimately decisions that are made during Mental Health Act assessments are whether or not somebody should be detained to hospital against their wishes. So I think we can talk more broadly about co-production as a great thing, but then if at the crux of it, there is still an event that can happen where someone's decision making can be taken right from them, how can we try and put some of these principles of co-production into action? Is it possible to do so? Thinking about the day, I think there was a general view that it's really almost impossible to say that co-production can be applied in coercive settings, because by their very nature there's this idea that there's this huge power of the people who can make decisions under the Mental Health Act, and potentially for the person that decision's being made about, a really disempowering event. And so to try and think about the ways in which we can perhaps try and work towards involving people more, not only in the actual Mental Health Act assessment, but perhaps how people are supported before those crisis events happen. So my interest, I suppose, is drawing upon my own practice as a social worker and also some of the research evidence, which has looked at how the ways in which practitioners do try to take into account somebody's views on that day. So somebody who's experienced a mental health crisis, how can they actually fully participate in that decision? Particularly because a Mental Health Act assessment might be taking place completely unexpectedly, so someone could be sat at home and there's a knock at the door and suddenly big decisions are being made about whether they need to go to hospital. So how can we try and, in that moment, actually help somebody feel involved? Is it possible? So as I said, I think it's really hard to do it in the moment, but I do believe that we can apply some of the values of co-production, this idea about it not being, the practitioners or the so-called professionals who can do the assessments and hold the greater weight of knowledge, but to truly recognise that a mental health service user or survivor actually does know their own situation best. And if we can find ways to have a dialogue that enables people to talk openly about their experiences, maybe around risk assessments or care planning, so in the earlier stages of their care, prior to any crisis happening. So an example might be that rather than perhaps critiquing the way we traditionally think about risk, so actually asking somebody to draft their own risk assessment, which I don't always think happens in mental health care, and to use the language that person chooses, and perhaps to define their own thresholds for what's acceptable risk for them. So for example, somebody might experience thoughts about harming another person, but if that's something they have day in, day out and they can manage, then actually for them that isn't that risky, or so-called, or would be potentially perceived by a worker as risky. But to help somebody feel in an environment that it's okay to actually disclose those kind of thoughts, I think there has to be a lot of work done to put somebody at ease. So rather than to worry that everybody's going to suddenly panic and say, we need to admit this person to hospital because they're describing things that sound risky. So I suppose it's just stepping back and really trying to think about risk in a different way. And this isn't new stuff that I'm saying, this is I think like the recovery model, which has been something that mental health policy has taken on board perhaps, but has been driven by a service user or survivor perspective. I think this has been said for a lot of years, but maybe with co-production as a term that is perhaps brought more into the mainstream, these sorts of ideas can be revisited and actually reconsidered by practitioners. So I think, yeah, it would be about perhaps making sure that in terms of co-production that somebody can draw up their own maybe advanced statement about, in the event of a crisis, what they want to happen, what they want to be called, what they want to describe their experiences as. So for example, if someone finds the term schizophrenia as really unhelpful, how do they describe what's happening? So to try and just find terms that are agreed upon rather than led by the professionals. And I also think that if somebody can perhaps, as I said, a threshold for what for them is unmanageable, which might then say actually, yeah, perhaps an admission to hospital is helpful. But to do that at an earlier stage, because as I say, I think to actually do that in the moment of a Mental Health Act assessment would be really difficult, given the person's potentially in quite an emotionally distressed state and suddenly might have a social worker, an AMP, 2 doctors, potentially the police, an ambulance crew, this big group of people who can feel really intimidating. So perhaps, as I say, stepping back and thinking about how we can avoid those situations happening, or if they do happen, how somebody can feel they've got more control or a voice in what's going on. I think for me, the fact that the seminar was attended by a broad group of participants, so it wasn't all academics or practitioners or service users, or carers, there was a mix of people, and I think that's what it should be about, because quite often, particularly perhaps events led by universities might be disproportionately attended by people that work in academia, or who maybe are or practitioners who feel they haven't got the time to attend because of demands in their everyday work. But I think the fact that there was a real wide group of people, so the discussion that people were able to have seemed really open and brought together different perspectives, but also different forms of knowledge. And there was the idea of co-production is, there is no a privilege to any kind of knowledge, or at least perhaps we should even privilege the knowledge of the people that are experiencing the services. So, and I think that was reflected in the kind of discussions and breakdown of the people that were attending. And I think there seemed a real passion for change. That people do feel inspired by these seminars, and that it's not just about talking in a room about these ideas, but actually how they can then translate into practice, and how that could actually make a difference for people's experience of mental health services. It almost feels that the seminars provide kind of a space to almost distill all these thoughts and ideas that people have, and then to bring them in one place where hopefully, because it's then collectively the knowledge is produced, that for example there was talk about when the Tories were recently re-elected about drafting a new mental health bill, and seeing that as an opportunity to then feed back some of these ideas in the consultation. So the ideas about how we understand risk, and how we the whole premise, I suppose, of the Mental Health Act being so out of kilter with the ideas of co-production and upholding human rights. So I think it feels a really positive space for people to talk openly, and perhaps to challenge some of the dominant ideas that do still pervade within mental health services, but with a real link to everyday practice and what actually goes on in the real world, rather than just sat in a room talking about these ideas.